And a lot of indications are pointing to a much slower rebuild, which probably means a little bit longer period of sustained high prices, which I think is good news.
Dr. Kenny Burdine from the University of Kentucky is my guest today as we talk about the Big Four. I'm not talking about the Big Four you think I might be, but it's the Big Four cattle market questions that he and I talked about back in January of this year. And now, as we're about to close out or getting close to closing out 2025, do we have any answers to those questions? First, we're going to be talking heifer retention. Are we seeing more being retained? Then we're going to get into slaughter weights. Are those continuing to increase? The third thing, will we see a growth in other proteins like pork and poultry? And finally, we're going to be talking trade and tariffs. Then we're going to pivot and discuss some things to be aware of if you plan to keep and grow your own replacements or buy them.
By holding back heifers, by not selling these weaned heifers, you're essentially giving up the value of the most valuable heifer you've probably ever weaned.
And while many of us may be reflecting on decisions around the last record high cattle market in 14 and 15, we need to look at what's before us with this goal in mind.
I want to look back on the 24, 25, 26 cattle market and think, I really did a good job utilizing that income that I had.
From the bigger cattle market picture to decisions made just one cow at a time, that's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Justin Mills with you, and thank you for tuning in and joining us on the program. We do have a lot to cover. So as you heard there in the opening, we're going to be answering those 4 cattle market questions as well as a sidebar discussion talking about some things to be aware of when you are looking at either keeping replacements or buying them. So I think you'll find that valuable. One other discussion coming up later in the show, we're going to be talking about tips for rebreeding success and setting cows up for their next calf. You might think, well, this is the fall of the year. Why are we doing that? There's a reason for that. We're going to be talking about that later on. Then, of course, meteorologist Don Day will be in as we take a look at our long-range weather. Hey, how many of you have your latest issue of Working Ranch magazine? If you don't, it should be coming in your mailbox here pretty shortly. And if you don't have one or have a subscription, you can go to workingranchmag.com and start a subscription today. Or you can stop by your local Tractor Supply store and pick one up right there off the shelf. And a shout out here today to the Tractor Supply store in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in Laurel, Montana, in Lawrence, Kansas, and in Lincoln, Nebraska. Well, let's turn towards our subject at hand here today. And joining us, as I said at the top of the program, is Dr. Kenny Burdine. He is out of the University of Kentucky. And Dr. Burdine, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Well, thanks for inviting me back. I've been looking forward to it.
Well, if you go back to episode 200, it was at the very end of January 2025, and Dr. Burdine joined us as we were talking about what are the 4 cattle market questions that we hope to see answered in 2025. Really right now, the whole industry is kind of watching, are we going to see heifers retained? What are you seeing out there based upon what we were talking about almost a year ago?
Yeah, I think the short answer to the question, Justin, is we're not seeing a lot of heifer retention. There's a couple things we look at. We like to look at those quarterly cattle on feed numbers because every quarter we get an estimate of what percent of on feed inventory is heifers. And, July 1, the last one that I've got, we were at 38.1%. That number would be, probably in the mid 30s anyway, if we were seeing a lot of heifer retention. The other thing we can point to, we get the annual inventory numbers in January. We did get a mid-year inventory number this year. And I like to look at that heifer retention number. In other words, those heifers held for beef cow replacement. And I like to look at that as a percent of beef cow inventory. Okay. So in other words, what percent of the inventory are we holding heifers to potentially replace? That number was 12.9% July 1 of this year, and that would have been the lowest percentage in that entire data set that goes back to 1973. So I think the shorter answer is we're not really retaining much heifers. At least we weren't as of summer. We'll get a little better picture as we move through the rest of this year. One addendum, if I can add something, Justin, that I think I didn't expect in January, is how much beef cow slaughter has been down again in 2025. And I think that's kind of related to this discussion, down over 18% year to date from last year. So that really is the mover this year. I think we're going to go into 2026 with a little bit larger cow herd, but not because of heifer retention in the last year. It's more about the fact that we simply not culled this cow herd as hard in 2025.
Yeah. From a producer myself, I could see that. I think you're going to keep a cow just because it is, when you look at the cost of buying bred heifers or bred cattle versus do I just keep this old girl one more year? That's the decision I think is being made out there.
You said it perfectly. And the only other thing I would add is, we have to remember we did cull this cow herd pretty hard back in 2021, especially 2022. So I think you could argue that probably the cow herd got a little bit younger, coming into the last couple of years. So it may have well been that, the cow herd was a little younger. Maybe we'd made some of those easier culling decisions already.
Yeah. And I'm trying to recollect back. It just seems to me like even in our conversation and also in conversations that I've had with other folks, feeling like this retention or this build back, if it's going to happen, is really coming slower than expected.
It really does seem that way. One thing we talked about when you and I chatted back in January was we talked about, how does this look compared to 2014-15? And a lot of indications are pointing to a much slower rebuild, which probably means a little bit longer period of sustained high prices, which I think is good news.
Yeah. So then my question to that is why? I've had it. In fact, the other day I was having a discussion. I'd called a guy that I deal with, and we put Wagyu bulls on our heifers. And so I was we were visiting with him. That's who I got to get lined up to send all these calves back to Nebraska or Iowa, where they're going to feedlot back there. But we were kind of reminiscing on kind of what's going on out there in the industry and what's causing this slow rebuild and all this. What's your thoughts? What do you think are some factors that's causing this slow rebuild?
I'll mention a couple things, and these are just things that I kind of immediately gravitate towards. The first one that always comes to my mind is interest rate environment right now, right? That to me is probably the big one, that sticks in my mind. Interest rates are much higher in 2025 than they were in 14-15. And that impacts a lot of things. But, the biggest thing that it does is that it kind of increases the preference for money today over money tomorrow, right? Mm-hmm. And when you think about heifer retention, it really is the ultimate trade-off. You're getting up dollars today, a lot of dollars actually, by not selling those heifers. And then you're doing that, for an increased stream of cash flows in the future. But again, with higher interest rates, the money today seems more attractive. A couple other things I'll point out, and, we're in different parts of the country, so I think makes this so neat that we can share ideas and talk back and forth. But, we went through about 7 tough years in the cow-calf sector. As we came out of that 14-15 time period, things were pretty tight for a long period of time. In fact, these calf values right now are more than double what they were just 3 years ago. So I kind of wonder, are we seeing a little bit of kind of a recouping of capital, maybe, from some of those tough times? And this probably is a little bit region specific, but I can certainly speak to my area. You would know yours and listeners would know theirs, but land availability is a problem in some places and land cost. And I also think that comes into play. It certainly does in the Southeast where I call home. That is an issue I think that does limit expansion in this area some.
Yeah, I think that's what you're seeing in Kentucky. I think you could say that probably everywhere across the country. Now, what's really, really very interesting in what you just talked about in the 3 factors that you identified. I mean, I'll tell you what, it's like you were listening in on our conversation, dead on exactly the things that we talked about, the first 2 things, interest rates and those 7 tough years. I think interest rates, as you said, you did a good job of explaining, kind of the money side of things. But I think when you look at the second thing too, the 7 tough years that the cow-calf industry had coming out of the last big cycle or big high cattle markets in that, I think folks are still recouping from some lessons learned, don't you think? And I'm saying from my own experience, I'm still paying off that tuition on that lesson from 2014.
I hear a lot of those similar stories and anecdotes. There were a lot of people, I think, that bluntly made decisions back in 14 and 15 with an expectation that market would hold much longer than it did.
Yeah.
And, that applies to a lot of things. Obviously, breeding stock comes to mind immediately, right? But it applies to a lot of things, land, equipment, what have you. And I think that's one of the messages about, this period. 2024 was a good year. 2025 is an extremely good year. I think 2026 will be another really good year. And I think that the real message should be, you want to look back 5, 10 years from now and say, I really did a good job utilizing that opportunity that I had, because this market is an incredible opportunity to do a lot of things. Expansion may be one of those possibilities, but there's a lot of other things you may want to think about as ways to invest in your cow herd besides simply increase the number of cows that you run.
Yeah, I think so too. Very good. Okay, Kenny, let's take a break here, and we've still got 3 more questions that we talked about in the first interview that we did. I want to get through those, and I don't know that we'll have as much discussion on those because I think really heifer retention is the big subject that everybody's talking about out there. We're going to talk slaughter weights coming up next, and also are we seeing a growth in pork and poultry, and we'll also talk trade. Those are the other 3 questions that came up. We'll talk about that and how those are being answered as we are further down the road in 2025 when we come back. This segment today brought to you by Allflex. It all starts with the tag, the most trusted portfolio of ID solutions.
It all starts with the tag. Identifying each animal allows you to better manage the entire herd and control your operation's future. For nearly 70 years, producers have chosen Allflex for individual animal management. With Allflex, you get the most trusted portfolio of ID solutions. Whether you need stock or custom visual tags, electronic tags, tissue sampling units for DNA collection, or syringes, bring the Allflex advantage to your operation today. Visit allflexusa.com to learn more.
Okay, Dr. Burdine, the second question that we talked about when we talked last time was slaughter weights. As we had seen slaughter weights continuing to get larger and larger, and in some ways people wondering, what in the world, can we get any bigger than that? So what are you seeing with the answer to that particular question?
Yeah, I'll give you the short answer first. Yes, they can and did keep increasing. For the sake of transparency, I'm kind of just averaging our weekly steer dressed weights here, but up over 20 pounds year to date on that weekly data. So they have kept increasing. And, I guess when you kind of think about where we are, feed prices have continued to moderate. So I think, cost of gain is a little bit lower. Cattle supplies are even tighter. Cattle values are higher, which means that value of gain is higher. And that basically means the incentive is to keep adding pounds, given how tight supplies are. One more comment I'll make, we saw harvest weights go up significantly last year, and it was enough to offset the decrease in slaughter. By that, I mean, although slaughter was down, it was largely offset by higher weights. So we saw a slight increase in beef production in 2024. That's not going to be the case in 2025, where, slaughter weights are not going to be up enough to offset the decrease in slaughter. So we are definitely going to see a decrease in production for 2025.
So let's take that then, the ramifications of that. Okay, it's not the same as 24, 25, 25, 26 is going to look a little different in that because we're not going to be able to make that difference back up, which kind of maybe will lead us eventually into the next question that we need to talk about, and that is the growth in the other proteins that are at the meat counter. But so ramification wise, because we're not identical to 24, 25, 25, 26 is not, what do you anticipate to see then?
Well, I think first of all, that's exactly why we're seeing the price levels that we're seeing, right? And you think about it, it's really interesting to think about how strong prices were in 2024, despite the fact that production was actually up a little bit. And now you take that same strength in demand, and it's been there, and then you overlay that with a pretty significant decrease in production, you see these price levels that we're seeing. And the truth of the matter is, this is not going to change in the short run. It's going to continue to be tight for a while until we start to see some growth in the sector.
Yeah. Okay. So when we look at slaughter, and then of course that also brings into the context of the conversation, I should say, in terms of pricing at the meat counter. And then we start talking about alternative proteins that then consumers have that choice of. Let's talk about that particular question. That was number 3 in our discussion that we had previously. So are we seeing a growth in pork and poultry due to the price that we're seeing in that, or is demand just so good that we're staying where we need to be?
I definitely think demand is strong, and I think all the discussion about tight supplies is definitely, warranted. But I think we also need to make a point that demand has been very strong. Folks are paying a lot of money for all these proteins, beef especially at the retail and food service levels. I've been watching box beef recently, Justin. Box beef has pulled down quite a bit the last several weeks. Some of that's seasonal, right? We're kind of past the summer, grilling season, if you will. We're kind of past that. But I think what we're seeing is more than just a seasonal drop. So that kind of brings us to those substitute meats. And one of the questions that I was thinking about when you and I talked in January, and this really did make a difference in 2015. If we think about the three main meats that we eat in the U.S., beef, pork, and chicken, obviously the rate at which they can respond is very different.
Yeah.
Right? Chicken can respond much faster than pork faster than beef. And we saw some significant increases, especially in pork production, very quickly from 14 to 15. To answer the question, though, we've not really seen that this year. We're going to see a slight increase in pork production. That's going to be driven by productivity. The September hogs and pigs report actually had the breeding hog herd down. So we're not seeing a growth in numbers, if you will. Everything's being driven by productivity. And on the poultry side, broilers, we're going to see something less than a 2% increase in production. And that's a segment that typically grows, 2.5% a year. So short answer is we're not seeing abnormally large growth in the production of pork and poultry.
All right. So what's that spell out then? What if you throw all that together, mix it all up, and then read the cards on all that? What is it saying to you?
I think it still speaks to the fact that we're probably set up fundamentally pretty well, certainly from a supply perspective, for another good year or two in the cattle sector.
Yeah.
And I think to me the wild cards are more on the demand side than the supply side as we look at the rest of 2025 and certainly 2026.
Yeah. Alluding back to the discussion I was telling you that I was having previously with a gentleman out of Nebraska. And one of the things fundamentally, if you just look fundamentally at the numbers, there's a lot of reasons that this market should be where it's at for considerably longer than we were in the 2014 era of that cattle market cycle. So that the only thing that concerns out there is that could have an issue with that would be if something significant were to happen, whether, I don't know. And I don't want to say, I'm cautious about saying that because I do not like to do the sky is falling. I'm not that kind of a person, but fundamentals that this market should be strong, but there's always that what if thing out there.
Sure. You said it well. The supply fundamentals look very good. I do think the questions are on the demand side. But, there's things that we're bluntly not going to see coming. If we could see them coming, right, they're easy to manage, right? Yeah. But, one of the strategies in risk management is you try and manage some of the risks that you don't anticipate. And, you don't know what that's going to be. I don't really like the term black swan, but that kind of gets thrown out, right? But I think it does speak to using some risk management tools that exist to try and cover yourself in a market like this. Don't let this market get away, I guess is the story.
Yeah. Okay. Talking market, then and of course, this was another big question. I think back to because it was a change in administration back in Washington, D.C. And the fourth question that we talked about last year or in January was trade course / tariffs. All of that. And that was really on everybody's mind. And now that we're down the road again, I don't know that some of those have been completely answered, but there's maybe a little bit more light in there. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so the impact of trade and trade policy, I'd say this one is evolving. So we're learning as we go, and things are changing, quite a bit. In fact, there's been changes here recently.
Yeah.
But whenever someone asks me about the impact of trade and tariffs and so forth, I like to remind them that it really is trading partner specific. And, by that, I mean, we've got countries that we largely only export beef to. We've got some we largely only import beef from, and we have some that we see two-way trade with. So I think that's important to think about is, what countries are at play. We'll kind of go high level first. And I guess, full transparency, government shutdown. So I don't have the most recent monthly trade report. So I'm using the report that goes through the end of July. But through July, exports were down a little over 9% from last year. But when you think about that alongside with how tight supplies are and how strong prices have been, that to me does not signal a concern on the international demand side. Mm-hmm. Now, there are certainly some countries that are worth mentioning. China's gotten a lot of attention, large tariff rates there. Exports to China for the year through July, year over year, down about 90%. So that's an example of one where we've definitely seen some impact from. The import picture, you can imagine much the opposite story. Imports up about 30% through July. Most countries are higher. And again, we're short on beef. Prices are high. That is kind of attractive for some countries to try and move product into the U.S. Brazil is certainly one to watch. They had really been sending a lot of beef into the U.S. That's slowed down a great deal since spring, and even more, I think, since August, but I don't have that August monthly data. But the weekly data says it's really pulled back quite a bit this summer.
Yeah. And the trade thing, I think that's, we're always looking at literally the product itself, the beef product itself. But when we look at our industry as a whole, ranching, I think one of the things that we also look at, and was kind of reminded me of the times that we are in now, I was ordering electric fence supplies. And I said, boy, these have really gone up. And the response was, well, tariffs. And I think probably from a ranching side, while the import-export is definitely, we need to be aware of that, and there's some effects there, and that's definitely to be keen on. But I think the other side of things, it's everything that we've all been dealing with, from inflation issues, supply chain issues, to now tariff issues that's affecting goods and supplies that we use on a day-to-day basis.
That's a really good point. I kind of quickly went to the import and export of meat products, which matter, like you said, but there's an impact on inputs and production costs, certainly, that matters. And you do hear that story a lot as you're shopping for a lot of things. The other thing I should have mentioned, Justin, that I didn't, we also should just make a point of saying something about live animal trade. And of course, that's also been affected quite a bit this year. We've not had imports from Mexico for a period of time in the early part of 2025, but they probably accounted for something between 4 and 5% of our feeder cattle supply. Okay, we've not been getting those. That's made a feeder cattle market even tighter.
Yes, and until, of course, the Mexican screwworm deal is going to still continue to play a factor in that and keeping that border closed, it sounds like, with USDA Secretary Rollins being pretty aggressive on that, I would say, for the most part. So I anticipate that to probably stay there until something, we get further into these winter months.
That would be my guess. There have been a couple recent cases a little closer to the U.S. I think one was 70 miles south, and then the most recent was maybe 170 miles south, if my memory serves me correctly. And, the market responded, the feeder cattle market, I should say, responded positively to both of those, because I think it did exactly what you just did. It said, okay, this probably means this border is going to stay closed for longer.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we've answered the 4 questions, and one of the first questions, of course, we were talking about heifer retention. So I want to, in this next segment, I want to jump really quick into heifers and that discussion that always comes around: buy or develop your heifers, and some questions that we can consider, some things to think about in that. I want to do that when we come back next, okay?
Sounds great.
This segment today brought to you by Identity Beef from Neogen. Uncover your herd's potential with Identity Beef. In a world of variables that are beyond our control, there's a tool that can provide certainty for your breeding program. I'm talking about Identity Beef. It's the first genomic profile designed for crossbred commercial cattle. Now, here's a tool that's going to utilize DNA to rank the genetic merit for 17 key traits, from maternal to performance to carcass traits, as well as mitigate risk factors, for example, like congestive heart failure. It's time to take the gamble and the waiting game out of your breeding program. Make accurate decisions with confidence and uncover your herd's potential with Identity Beef. To learn more, contact your Neogen representative today or visit neogen.com/identity-beef. All right, joining us here today is Dr. Kenny Burdine out of the University of Kentucky. And Dr. Burdine, we've already went through and talked about the 4 questions, kind of looking at some things that you and I had talked about previously back in the first part of the year. And of course, the discussion, that number 1 question was about heifer retention. So when we start talking heifer retention, then we see out there everything from what should I do? Should I raise my own? Should I be buying them? And so I'll just kind of throw it out there. And I know there's some things to consider in that, but that's really when we start looking at folks wanting to expand and grow their herd, that's the 2 things they're weighing out, aren't they?
Absolutely. And there's no perfect answer. Should I buy a bred heifer? Should I develop my own? There's good reasons to do both, and I think it depends on the individual operation. But I like to point out a few things that I think sometimes get forgotten when people are thinking through this. And it's so common when I visit with producers in my extension travel, that they'll look at what bred heifers are selling for, and that's usually a big number, no matter what the market is, right? And then they'll kind of compare that to what they think they can do it for, what they can do it for. And they immediately gravitate towards it's going to be much cheaper to develop these heifers on my own. And I think in a lot of cases that's true. I'd like to point out a few things that are worth just kind of mentioning that don't always get quantified maybe the way that they should. The first is the most obvious. And I think, we even talked about this in the first segment a little bit. By holding back heifers, by not selling these weaned heifers, you're essentially giving up the value of the most valuable heifer you've probably ever weaned right now.
Yeah.
So, that's cost number one. Mm. And that's going to be a cost you're going to have, going forward for a while. That's north of $2,000 in most markets right now. So that definitely matters. That's cost number one. The other thing that I think people sometimes forget is, I can pencil out a budget, what it's going to cost me to keep that heifer for a year, breed or whatnot, and get her to the same, roughly the same stage of production as a bred heifer. But I also have to remember that if I'm looking to add 10 cows to my herd, I'm not going to hold back 10 heifers, right? Mm. They're not all going to make the cut.
Yeah.
I'm going to hold some back. I'm going to spend some money developing them. I'm going to spend some money breeding them. I'm going to have some expensive heifers that either don't breed or that I simply don't like. They're probably going to end up getting moved as heavy feeders, and I'm probably going to lose a little bit of money on those. And the money that I lose on those that I intend to be replacements that don't become replacements, that kind of becomes an additional cost on the ones that I do end up keeping. Mm-hmm. And again, you've kind of got to think through that. And then the third thing I like to remind folks, and this one is simple, but it hardly ever gets mentioned, is the timing really matters. If you think about it, just kind of the simple way to think about this, you just kind of apply it to the current market. So think about a spring-born heifer in 2025 that's weaned in fall of 2025. If I choose not to sell her, if I retain her, I'm going to breed her in the spring in 2026. She'll probably calve sometime winter, spring 2027. She should wean her first calf in the fall of 2027 that I could sell as a cow-calf operator. If instead I go and I buy a bred heifer in the fall of 2025, that bred heifer should wean her first calf in the fall of 2026. So I get a calf to sell a year sooner. So I just kind of throw it out there. What's the likely profit on that heifer calf that I get from the bred heifer in 2026 that I don't get until 2027 on when I develop myself? And that profit, if you think about it, kind of gets bid into or gets capitalized into the value of those bred heifers that are being sold right now. So that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it does matter, especially in a strong market like this one, when profit matters. And then the fourth thing I'll mention, and I'll stop talking, Justin, let you respond. But I wrote some of this up for Cattle Market Notes a few months ago, and I got a really nice email from a gentleman that said, Kenny, you really ought to also mention the impact on genetics and quality. And that's a fair point, So yeah. I can tell you in some cases, someone who's buying bred heifers is getting better heifers on average. Some case they're not. But the point being made that, you certainly want to think about, am I improving or am I not improving the quality of my herd by going outside?
Yeah, that's a good point. And really, that is the general purpose. If you're buying them, hopefully you are buying better genetics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm sure there's situations where someone spent a lot of time developing their own genetics and it doesn't make sense to do that. But I think in a lot of cases, you can get good quality bred heifers from the outside as well.
Yeah. So there's some caveats in some of this that I see, because I think just in general, some of the things that you talked about are absolutely maybe overlooked. And so I think that was good to spell those out. One of the things that I look at too is, I think for folks too, you also need to weigh in as far as how you run a cattle herd versus the cattle herd these replacements are coming out of. For example, in our situation where we're a little more drier climate, these cows are having to cover a lot of country, kind of having to work a little bit. For me to go buy replacement heifers out of somebody's herd that's been probably a little more taken care of, so to speak. But on the other side, taking a cow that's been a little bit more, I guess maybe lower input into and putting them into an environment where they're going to get taken care of is probably a better fit. But I think you have to really understand how you plan to manage and take care of that cattle on what you're searching for if you're going to be buying replacements.
I agree. And I think that's why it's so individualized.
Yeah.
You want to make sure if you're buying breeding stock that you're buying the kind of breeding stock that do well in the region that you're farming and they're going to perform well in your management system.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's such a unique and individualized decision.
You know, something else is we're talking about this, and I would say in the last several years, we've been keeping replacement heifers, but here's why. And I'm going to say this isn't, you can't say, okay, this is what we're going to do from here for the next 20 years. It's been because of the market. I think you have to play the numbers out, don't you think, in terms of how on that retention deal? I mean, for us, we've been able to keep every heifer, everything, and then we do the sort by what breeds up in first, second cycle, and we sell the third and fourth cyclers. We've made money on that, but that's only because the market's been going up. In a different environment, you could be sucking air on that deal, couldn't you?
Sure. And all this stuff is going to be impacted by the market. And I think this is kind of related to what you're saying. You know, we talk a lot about how we tend to retain heifers when they're most valuable. And sometimes it almost seems counterintuitive. But I think where you're going is, you know, sometimes it needs to be a strong market, right? For me to be able to sell fewer and still meet obligations,
yes,
you know, on the ones that I do sell. And that's what this market actually offers opportunity to do, right? I mean, I've got a lot more income coming from the ones that I'm selling. So maybe I don't have to sell as many and I can still meet my obligations. I hear that sometimes as well.
Yeah. Well, I think you've identified some really good points. Everything from understanding the opportunity cost in that. Boy, they all won't make the cut. I think that is a good, you know, you can't keep 10 expecting in two years you're going to have 10 there. It's not going to be that way. And then, of course, as you were saying, you know, the timing. And that's a big deal, too, because right now there is some advantage to really jumping in and taking advantage of this market right now.
I agree. It's an interesting time for sure. Lots of interesting decisions to be made, but a lot of opportunity as well.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Burdine, I'm glad to have you here on the program again. Just maybe some final comments from you as you recap kind of what we talked about here today, and just as you look ahead for this market. Maybe we need to get back together in January again and say, okay, what's the next 4 questions you got in mind?
That sounds good. We should probably do it. But it's always good visiting with you, and I enjoy talking about the cattle markets. And as we look back on what we talked about in January and where we are now, I think we learned a lot, and I think we're going to learn a lot more going forward. But I think I would want to leave with this notion that the supply fundamentals do look good. You know, there's definitely a wild card, so I think managing downside risk is always a good strategy. But I've kind of reiterated what I said a couple segments ago. I really think the goal should be, you know, I want to look back on the 24, 25, 26 cattle market and think, I really did a good job utilizing that income that I had. You know, I hope I use that to set me up for the next 5-10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Boy, that is some great advice. And you're right. That's what we all want to get down 10 years down the road and say, boy, I really hate paying on that tuition that I'm learning on that lesson in particular, but other than say, you know, I was wise. And how did we use that to build our profitability even further down the road in those tough times? So appreciate it, Dr. Burdine. Good to visit with you here today on the program.
Thanks for having me again.
You bet. And again, that was Dr. Kenny Burdine out of the University of Kentucky, livestock agricultural economist, joining us here on our program today. Appreciate his insight into the market and our industry as well. Now, last time we had Dr. Burdine on, I had mentioned this, and he, along with a couple other of his counterparts, Josh Maples at Mississippi State University and James Mitchell, who is at the University of Arkansas, all three of these guys go together and put out a weekly market recap report that comes right to your email on Mondays. That report is entitled Cattle Market Notes Weekly. And if you'd like to subscribe to that, if you search in your web browser, you pretty good chance it'll come up. I will also put a link in my show notes as well that you can click on that and subscribe. Again, that report is Cattle Market Notes Weekly. That is a Monday report that comes out, and I encourage you to check it out for yourself. Well, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to be talking about getting these cattle transitioned and ready to go for calving and rebreeding. Yeah, kind of seems a little bit odd to be talking about that now, but there's a reason for that. We're going to talk about it when we come back. But now here's the Captain Tim O'Byrne with this.
Hey everybody, Tim here. We're fixing to come up on 1 million downloads of our Working Ranch radio show podcast, which is really exciting. And it got me to thinking about another viral moment that we had back in 2017 when we ran a short Facebook video of the safety zone calf catchers. And it was so popular, it got 6.8 million views in the first 5 days. I want you folks to check it out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers. It's a great product for all producers. Keep you safe when you're working with baby calves, especially for old timers like me who maybe can't outrun those cows anymore. Check them out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers.
Calving season is a favorite time of year, but along with that special time are dangers, extra stress, and increased labor. Safety Zone Calf Catchers are all about safety and making processing new calves easier. Designed for ATVs or UTVs, one person can do the job and never be threatened by the protective mother cow. Make this and every calving season safer and easier with a Safety Zone Calf Catcher. Watch videos and customer testimonials or order yours today at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914. Affordable and made in the USA. Make your upcoming and all future calving seasons safer, easier, and stress-free. Durable and designed to work anywhere you can drive your ATV or UTV. Order online at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914 today.
And joining us now here on the Working Ranch Radio Show is Dr. Elizabeth Ballou with Purina Animal Nutrition. She is a cattle nutritionist there. And Dr. Ballou, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. Looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Well, I know when we start our conversation out and we talk about rebreeding success and setting cows up for their next calf, everybody's going to be like, well, what do you mean? This is the fall of the year. Why is that such a big deal now? But I think there's a lot of validity in our conversation here today because it really is kind of the reset for this cow. We've maybe weaned these calves off. If not, it's going to be happening pretty quick. And it's sort of that reset time. So it is a pretty important time. And I want you to expand a little bit more about why this time of the year is a really good time to start thinking about that next calf crop and rebreeding.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And having that thought process of starting now is really where I like to take the conversation with customers and producers across the country. Because at the end of the day, how those cows calve in terms of body condition score is ultimately going to impact their next rebreeding success. So while we might be 6 months away from spring calving cow herds turning bulls out, we really need to be backing it up to today so that we can make sure that cow is in good body condition score, a body condition score 6, so that when she calves, she has enough energy to support her calf, and still at the end of the day get rebred when that time comes.
Yeah. Well, and you just kind of answered sort of my next question there, because some of those factors are just what you said. I mean, we want to establish a good body condition score so that as they move into that spring in the year and the calf is really drawing them down on the milk, that they have the condition to withstand that. Some of those other biggest factors, expand on that a little bit more about what determines that rebreed success for this cow after she has calved.
Right. And so as we think about that from a nutrition standpoint, right, at the end of the day, reproduction is going to be at the bottom of the goal. So you're going to have her maintaining her own growth and her own maintenance. You're going to have her supporting lactation. You're going to have her supporting that calf. And at the whole scheme of things, reproduction is going to be at the bottom. So if we don't meet her energy requirement, we don't meet her protein requirement, she can't support that calf. She's not going to rebreed. And so as we think about going into winter months, right, nutrition is even more important because it's going to be cold and their energy requirement is going to go up. They're supporting that calf, or in the case of fall calving cows, they're going to be breeding and they're going to be setting up that first stage of gestation for those fall calving cows. So really energy is going to play the role in her function. And so we got to start now so that we get her ready to go at calving so that she can support her calf and get rebred.
Mm-hmm. You know, a side note to this, and I know in the conversation in our industry as a whole is when are we going to start to see some build back of this herd? And I think as we start to look, there has been some guys doing that. And as you were talking about just cattle in general, I think let's narrow this down a little bit more and maybe focus a bit on these young cattle, these 2s and 3s that are still in that growing. It's going to be even more important, isn't it?
Right. 100% true. And I would agree with that. So when we think about replacement heifers, right, they theoretically should be the best genetics our producers have, right? They should be the best genetics that are on my place, your ranch, wherever that may be. And if we shortchange them on the front side, their longevity in the herd is not going to be what we desire, right? So a lot of times I have conversations with folks about supplementing replacement heifers, and I get a lot of pushback on that because, oh my goodness, I don't want to be out, a foot of snow pulling calves, and what does that do to her reproductive tract? But really, if we feed them to a body condition score 6, Okay. That means no ribs showing, round across the top, a little bit of tailhead fat and a little bit of brisket fat. Not a fat cow by any means. But when she calves for the first time, I want to make sure she's in a body condition score 6. Because again, as a first calving cow, she is lactating, she's losing teeth, she's still trying to grow, put weight on, and you want her to get rebred. And that's at the bottom. That's at the bottom of the totem pole. So when we think about replacement heifers and the investments that folks are making, whether they're buying replacements or they're retaining their own, they have to stay in the herd for at least 5 to 6 years for them to pay for themselves. And if they slip out in year 1 or year 2, that can be a pretty costly detriment to the cow herd. So as we think about rebuilding the herd, we really need to be focusing on those young cows so that they can make it to mature cows and stay in the herd for a long time.
Yeah, and I think hitting the longevity conversation that you hit there, topic that you hit, I think is, and we've talked about it here on our show, that is one of the biggest costs to our industry is a lack of longevity in our cattle herd. So I appreciate you hitting that topic a little bit.
And we have really good genetics out there. The genetic capability of these cows across the country is there to support that longevity. And so we just got to do them justice and make sure that we support them so that they can make it to that point.
Yeah. Okay. So this time of the year, a lot of folks moving. Of course, we've actually seen some pretty decent moisture in our neck of the woods. So we still got a little bit of green coming up in some places, but it is the fall of the year. The quality of that grass starts fading a little bit. And so as we make that transition into summer and now into fall and going to be looking at wintertime months, what are just some of the things that we need to be thinking about?
So the first thing that I would be thinking about is making sure that you're getting your forage tested, any of your stored forage that you may have put up through the summertime. In my part of the world, we didn't get that hay baled until later in the summer. So I really need to focus on how am I going to meet the cow's needs supplementation wise to get the most out of that forage. At the end of the day, our forage is our biggest resource as cattle producers, and I want to maximize that capability. But I don't know how to maximize it if I don't know what it is. So I always recommend with folks just getting an idea of what type of forage you have so that we can supplement the right forage at the right time.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I got a little lower quality, maybe I'd take that to some more mature cows, my higher quality forage to my younger cows, just so I can support them. So that's the number one thing that I would think about in terms of as we get ready for winter feeding is stored forage quality. And then just monitoring body condition score. We have 60 days-ish before the turn of the year. If I'm not looking at body condition score today, I don't know how far I need to get to where I need to be at a body condition score 6. So just in general, my figures are if I'm Missouri South, I'm anywhere 60 to 80 pounds between body condition scores. Missouri North, I'm 70 to 90 pounds. Mm-hmm. So really, I need to be making sure that I have enough time to get where I need to so that I don't have to push it at the end too hard. And be realistic. Can I get that done? Right? So those are the two things that I would really be focusing on right now is forage quality and cow body condition score.
Okay. All right. Now, I know Purina does quite a bit of research. What are you showing research-wise, especially when we start having this conversation about rebreed and conception rates and, of course, calf uniformity, those kinds of things? What have you found in your research?
Yeah, so this would be compiled across industry research and things that we've done within the organization. So I focus a lot on body condition score. It's the driver in my mind for everything that we need to get done. And at the end of the day, that's something I can see. I can see body condition score. I can't see if she's losing 0.5 pound a day. I can't see that she's gaining 0.5 pound a day, but I can look at her body condition score. So again, it all comes down to that. And really, body condition score 6 is what the data will tell you she needs to calve in. Okay. So if we want to have a productive cow, in my mind, a productive cow is one that weans off a calf, that gets 1 calf per cow per year. So if she calves today, 10/22, she needs to have a calf by 10/22 or 26. That is, in my mind, a productive cow. Yeah. That means she has 85 days to get rebred. 85 days. Okay. And by having her in a good body condition score when she calves, she will show signs of heat sooner. That correlates to getting her rebred sooner in the breeding season. So if I get more calves born in the first 21 days of the calving season, that means in my mind, I have a more uniform calf crop, which also means that, let's say they gain 2 pounds a day while they're nursing their mom, that's 40 extra pounds of weaning weight. And today, 40 pounds of extra weaning weight,
That's a lot.
it's a lot of money. It is. And I would also challenge you, when we don't have cattle prices the way they are today, that's even more important, because that's going to be the difference between making money and potentially losing money. So that's what I look at. Body condition score 6. She will show signs of heat sooner and have more calves born in the first 21 days of the calving season is really what I look for. That's a heritable trait too. It's lowly heritable, but if mom gets bred early in the breeding season and she has a heifer calf, as long as you take care of mom and that heifer, it's lowly heritable, but that heifer calf should breed sooner than her counterparts.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Well, Dr. Blue, before we head out here, I just want to give you an opportunity to leave us with some final comments regarding our conversation here today, some things that we can take away from this as we look at how the rebreeding success really does start now with our cattle herd.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I think about why we're talking about it now is because everything that we do in the beef cattle business is going to be impacted by body condition score. How many calves are born, how many cows get bred, what their weaning weight is, how many of them make it to weaning, all those things. But the other thing that we have to think about, and I can go really long on this, but each stage of gestation, critical things happen from a developmental standpoint for that calf. So many things are pre-programmed. Repro tract, lungs, muscle development, tissue development. If we don't have mom ready to go and she's struggling on the backside, it's just going to impact that next calf. And that should be our best genetics. So you always got to reprogram yourself, think about where I need to be for calving so I can impact next breeding season.
You bet. And if folks are interested in wanting to find out more information, where would they go?
If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your local Purina dealer. They are going to be your best local resource, as well as PurinaMills.com website. You can find information there and get in contact with some of the folks that work within the organization to answer your questions.
You bet. Well, Dr. Blue, good to have you here today on the program. I think a topic that deserves some time for sure as we are at this time of the year and looking ahead in that. And if there's one takeaway, be watching that body condition score, because that's going to give you a really good indicator on that. Thanks for being here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And again, that was Dr. Elizabeth Ballou, cattle nutritionist for Purina Animal Nutrition. Like she said, if you do have questions, reach out to your local Purina dealer, or you can also check them out online at purinamills.com.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
And joining us now with a look at our long-term weather is meteorologist Don Day, on the road today, but catching up via cell phone. And Don, always good to visit with you as we look ahead. It was interesting because I had in my notes in previous podcasts that I had watched of yours, one of the things you had also talked about was a QBO, kind of a stratospheric phenomenon that's taking place that gives us kind of maybe some backing that this winter could be a true winter.
Yeah. So what we have is what's called the quasi-biennial oscillation. I know that's a real big mouthful, but this is a phenomenon that happens high in the stratosphere. So we're talking 60,000 feet or so, where the winds in the stratosphere near the equator will flip direction. And this oscillation will go, on average, they go about every 2.5 years or so. And it may sound strange that something in the stratosphere near the equator could affect the weather in the mid-latitude, but it does. And what it does do is it causes the polar vortex that we'll talk about in the winter, that pocket of very cold air in the high latitudes. In previous winters, when we've been in the phase that we're going to be in, which is an easterly phase, historically, this has led to some cold winters, especially with Arctic outbreaks, to where you can have very big pushes of Arctic air get pretty far south. We did not have this pattern this past winter, nor the winter before. So there's a stronger likelihood, at least a higher probability, that we will have some bigger, stronger, colder outbreaks across North America this winter, especially compared to last year. Also, historically, it's led to snowier winters in the northern Rockies, the northern plains, and the Great Lakes. That's the part of the U.S. that tends, in this type of pattern, to get more wintry weather. Also of interest is that we have a weak La Nina, which is going to get weaker. And historically, when we see this phase of the QBO matched up with a weak or weakening La Nina, that's also a cold signal. So some of the winter forecasts you've been hearing, which have been saying, we could have some intensity to this winter. Well, that certainly is on the table with this QBO phase that we're going in right now.
Yeah. I just about had to mute you there because you just kept saying also and adding one more layer to this whole thing. And I'm thinking, if I let you say one more thing, this is going to get worse.
Well, alsos are better than but.
Okay. Well, we'll see about that, I guess. I'll talk to you next April about that. We'll see. Okay. So let's talk then maybe a little bit more near term here in kind of your 7 to 10 to 14 day outlook. We do see kind of plain Jane weather here for most of the country through the next week or so. But then latter part of the month, we start to pick up some steam in terms of some winter type weather.
Yeah, November is going to be off to a really nice start over a lot of the U.S. Above average temperatures for most of the nation. Really no major storm systems through the first 10 days of the month, close to that. So enjoy it because we do see some of our long-term modeling tools are suggesting a weather pattern for the second half of November, especially the week of Thanksgiving and then into that first week of December. There's a fairly strong likelihood of a more wintry pattern and one that's going to stick. And I do think the timing of it is probably starting just before Thanksgiving and leading up into that first week of December. Do expect it to be more stormy and more wintry.
All right. So what that tells me is that I've got about a week to 10 days to get my last cement project completed.
You would be wise to do so, yes.
Don, good to visit with you. Thanks for catching up with us here while you're on the road, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Sounds good.
And again, that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather here today discussion that leads us down the road of looking ahead for the next several months. Maybe not something we like to hear, but it's at least nice to have a little bit of forewarning. And so I appreciate him giving us that update here. By the way, if you want to follow along each and every day to his daily video podcast, you can go to his website at dayweather.com, and there's a link to his YouTube channel from there. Stay with us. I'll tell you about what we're going to be talking about on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. A deep dive next week into the markets as Lance Zimmerman with Rabobank joins us. And of course, one of those discussion points will be how the markets are reacting in light of the news from President Trump on the beef export market front. So tune in next week on the Working Ranch Radio Show, which is a production of Working Ranch Magazine. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.